Hello, y'all. It's me. It's Dr. G, and welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. In our last episodes, we navigated the turbulent waters of the 60s, the conservative backlash of the 70s, and the revival and Reagan revolution of the 1980s. And today we step into what feels like our own backyard, the recent past. A period that promised a new world order but delivered more complexities and challenges few could have ever foreseen. This is going to be our last episode in season 1, where we go over the basics of US history, and then we're going to dive into stories either not covered or not covered well enough by this initial season. So hopefully you'll stick around for more in-depth US history. But right now, we're going to pick up with the last chapter of our textbook, Chapter 30, The Recent Past. And we're going to chart a course through the early 90s, through the Clinton years, the seismic shifts of 9/11, George W. Bush into the Barack Obama's historic first term. We're going to explore how everything we've gone over in the previous episodes, from the echoes of Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, 2 world wars, a depression, and a Cold War, continue to resonate, shaping the very fabric of modern America. So buckle up as we examine the presidencies, the cultural shifts, the technological leaps, and the profound crises that define the close of the 20th century and the dawn of the 21st. So let's go. The early 1990s dawned with a sense of profound global transformation. The Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989, and by December of 91, the Soviet Union itself had dissolved. For the first time in nearly half a century, the specter of a Cold War confrontation lifted, leaving the United States as the world's sole superpower. This new reality led some thinkers, like political scientist Francis Fukuyama, to famously ask if we were witnessing the end of history. In his 1989 essay, Fukuyama posited, quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of history, but the end of history as such," end quote. The argument was that liberal democracy and market capitalism had won the great ideological battles of the 20th century. While this idea captured a certain optimism of the era, it would soon be tested by a host of new global and domestic challenges. Domestically, this new era ushered in with the 1992 presidential election, which brought William Jefferson Clinton to the White House. Clinton, the former governor of Arkansas, campaigned as a new Democrat. This was a conscious effort to reposition the Democratic Party, moving it toward a more centrist stance after the conservative ascendancy of the Reagan years. Clinton himself articulated this vision with his new covenant philosophy. During his campaign, he stated, quote, "The choice we offer is not conservative or liberal. In many ways, it's not even Republican or Democratic. It is different. It is new. I call it a new covenant," end quote. This third way approach sought to blend fiscal conservatism, an embrace of free trade, with welfare reform and a more democratic commitment to social programs and civil rights. It was a pragmatic strategy designed to appeal to a broader electorate, including the so-called Reagan Democrats, those primarily white working-class voters who had shifted their allegiance to the Republican Party in the 1980s. This new Democrat balancing act was in many ways a direct response to the political realities of the time. The electoral successes of Ronald Reagan and the rise of a powerful new right had demonstrated a significant shift in the American political landscape. There was a palpable public skepticism towards large-scale government intervention, a sentiment that had its roots in the backlash politics of the 70s and the 80s, and it was amplified through the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Consequently, for the Democratic Party to regain national power, a recalibration was necessary. However, this strategic move also carried risks. By distancing itself from some of the core tenets of traditional liberalism, the New Democrat approach risked alienated the party's progressive base, and it sparked internal debates about the party's identity and its commitment to the legacies of the New Deal and the Great Society. a tension that would continue to surface in American politics for the next several decades. This recalibration involved a shift in emphasis from direct government interventionism, characteristic of FDR's New Deal and LBJ's Great Society, towards policies that emphasized individual responsibility and market based solutions. President Clinton's economic agenda was central to his New Democrat philosophy. A key component was the North America Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which he signed into law on December 8, 1993. Clinton championed NAFTA with an optimistic projections, declaring, quote, NAFTA will tear down trade barriers between our three nations. It will create the world's largest trade zone and create 200,000 jobs in this country by 1995 alone, end quote. The other countries being Canada and Mexico. He also emphasized that accompanying environmental and labor agreements would ensure, quote, social progress as well as economic growth. NAFTA was and remains a highly controversial agreement. Proponents argued it would stimulate economic growth and create jobs by eliminating the trade barriers between the three countries. Critics, however, voiced strong concerns about potential job losses as U.S. companies might relocate to Mexico to take advantage of lower labor costs. Ross Perot, a third-party candidate in the 1992 election, famously warned of a giant sucking sound of jobs going south. The debate around NAFTA highlighted the accelerating trend of globalization and its complex impact on national economies and labor markets. This push towards globalization and free markets has deep historical roots, echoing back to the Gilded Age's rise of powerful corporations and the expansion of international markets. We saw these in earlier episodes. And just as in these earlier periods of industrial transformation, the 90s saw anxieties about labor displacement and the power of multinational corporations resurface again with renewed intensity. Another cornerstone of Clinton's domestic agenda was welfare reform. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 fundamentally reshaped the nation's social security net. This act replaced the long-standing Aid to Families with Dependent Children program with Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, and imposed time limits on benefits and mandating working requirements for recipients. Clinton framed this as a move towards greater individual responsibility, stating, quote, our goal must be to enable all our people to make the most of their lives, to move from a lifetime of dependence to one of independence, end quote. The reform did lead to a dramatic decline in welfare caseloads. However, it also drew sharp criticism. Peter Edelman, a former Clinton administration official who resigned in protest, called the law awful policy that would do, quote, serious injury to American children. There will be more malnutrition and more crime, end quote. This approach to welfare marked a significant departure from the principles underlying the New Deal's establishment of a federal safety net and the Great Society's expansion of these protections. It reflected the New Democrat effort to find a middle ground, but critics argued it disproportionately harmed the most vulnerable of families. The Clinton era also saw a major federal intervention in criminal justice with the passage of the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. Championed by then-Senator Joe Biden, the bill included a controversial three-strikes provision, funded 100,000 new police officers, and banned certain assault weapons. President Clinton, upon signing the bill, declared, quote, when I signed this crime bill, we together are taking a big step toward bringing the laws of our land back in line with the values of our people and beginning to restore the line between right and wrong, end quote. The bill was in response to a rising crime rate and public fear. Senator Biden in 93 spoke of, quote, predators on our streets, arguing, quote, we have no choice but to take them out of society, end quote. While the bill aimed to make communities safer, it has since been heavily criticized for its role in exacerbating mass incarceration, a phenomenon that disproportionately affects minority communities still grappling with the legacies that we began this course with. The domestic policies, NAFTA, welfare reform, the crime bill, illustrate the complex tightrope that Clinton was walking. He was attempting to navigate a political landscape heavily influenced by conservative ideas about limiting government and individual responsibility, while also trying to uphold certain traditional democratic commitments. The long term consequences of these policies, particularly for vulnerable populations and the justice system, continue to be debated and they're felt today. The tough on crime approach, for instance, certainly had antecedents in the law and order rhetoric that had gained traction all the way back to 1968, to the social upheavals of the late 60s and 70s, a backlash against the civil rights movement and anti war protests. With the Cold War over, the Clinton administration faced the challenge of defining America's role in a unipolar world. This led to interventions in Somalia and the Balkans, specifically Bosnia and Kosovo, aimed at peacekeeping and addressing humanitarian crises. These interventions, however, were often fraught with difficulty and met with mixed success. As one scholarly analysis puts it, quote, the Clinton administration displayed hesitation, vacillation, and ambivalence in addressing turmoil in Somalia, Bosnia, and Haiti. After suffering a setback in Somalia, the White House moved overcautiously and abdicated leadership in the Bosnian crisis, end quote. The Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1993, where 18 U.S. soldiers were killed, deeply impacted the administration's willingness to commit ground troops and to risk casualties. These post-Cold War interventions eventually and inevitably drew criticism to earlier American foreign policy debates and blunders. The desire to act as global peacekeeper echoed all the way back to Woodrow Wilson's ambitions after World War I to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, while the caution regarding troop deployment reflected the long shadow of the Vietnam War. The clear bipolar framework of the Cold War, which had guided U.S. policy for 5 decades, was gone, leaving a more ambiguous and complex international environment. Parallel to these political shifts, the 90s witnessed a technological revolution that would fundamentally reshape society again. The explosion of the personal computer, it's probably what you're listening to this on right now, as well as the internet into a mass phenomenon. In 1990, only 15% of American households owned a computer. By 1997, that number had jumped to 35%. This rapid adoption was fueled by key innovations. Tim Berners-Lee's development of the World Wide Web at CERN in 1989, which he envisioned as, quote, a universal and free information space to share knowledge, to communicate, and to collaborate, end quote, laid the initial groundwork. Then came user-friendly graphical web browsers like Mosaic, created in 1993 by Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, and its successor, Netscape Navigator, launched in 1994. Suddenly, the internet wasn't just for scientists and academics, it was for everyone. This accessibility sparked the dot-com boom, a period of massive economic growth and fervent financial speculation as investors scrambled to find the next Microsoft or Apple. Companies like Amazon and eBay, though yet to turn a profit in their early years, attracted enormous investment, perplexing traditional business leaders. The internet economy, encompassing online sales and the necessary infrastructure, was already valued at over $300 billion by the end of the decade. The societal impact was immediate and profound. Email and instant messaging platforms like ICQ and AOL Instant Messenger revolutionized communication, and I bet you if you grew up in this era, you remember the dinging sound for both of them. Global interactions now became instantaneous. As Mark Poster, an early Internet observer, noted in 1995, quote, The internet is more like a social space than a thing that, so that its effects are more like those of Germany than those of hammers, end quote. Online communities and forums blossomed, connecting people with shared interests across geographical boundaries. However, this digital gold rush also brought anxieties. Clifford Stoll, a contemporary critic, cautioned in 1995, quote, "It's not like the internet is worthless. It's just that there's not much there. It's a low-grade source of information. There's a lot of ore and not many nuggets," end quote. Others worried about telemolesters or telethugs, foreshadowing later concerns about online safety and misinformation. The internet also began to be used for political activism, with early examples like the opposition to the Lotus Marketplace database in 1991. The rapid ascent of the internet in the 90s was more than just a technological advancement. It was a seismic cultural and economic shift. It engendered immense optimism about a connected future, but also sowed the seeds of concern regarding the quality of information, the sustainability of its economic model, and its broader societal consequences. This era can be compared to earlier technological upheavals, like the advent of the printing press, the telegraph, or radio and television, each of which fundamentally altered how society communicated and organized itself. The speculative fervor of the dot-com boom, for instance, bore resemblance to the Gilded Age railroad speculation, where new technology spurred rapid investment, sometimes outpacing practical application or sustainable business models. The 1990s, in this sense, laid the digital foundation for the 21st century, with all its accompanying benefits and all of its complex challenges. The 90s saw the acceleration of the culture wars. These were not new battles, but rather an intensification of the social and cultural conflicts that had been simmering since the 60s and 70s. A key flashpoint was the debate over family values. In 1992, Vice President Dan Quayle famously criticized the popular TV show Murphy Brown for its portrayal of a successful, unmarried woman choosing to have a child. Quayle argued that the show was, quote, "mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice," end quote. Though initially met with some ridicule, Quayle's comments tapped into a broader conservative anxiety about the decline of the traditional nuclear family and the perceived erosion of moral standards, concerns central to the new right. Abortion remained, as it had been since Roe v. Wade in 1973, one of the most divisive issues in American life. Groups like Operation Rescue, founded in '86 by Randall Terry, employed direct action tactics, including blockading abortion clinics under the slogan, quote, "If you believe abortion is murder, act like it's murder," end quote. The Supreme Court's decision in 1989 in Webster versus Reproductive Health Services upheld several state restrictions on abortion, signaling a potential weakening of Roe and further energizing activists on both sides of the issue. The arts also became a battleground. Controversies erupted over the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, and their funding for artists whose work was deemed offensive by some conservative. Andres Serrano's photograph, entitled Piss Christ, that's actually the name of it, and Robert Mapplethorpe's homoerotic photography drew particular ire. Senator Jesse Helms denounced these works as, quote, "blasphemous and pornographic," end quote, and it led efforts to restrict NEA funding. This ignited fierce debates about artistic freedom, about censorship of the government, as well as the role of government in funding art that challenged societal norms. The culture wars of the 90s, amplified by the burgeoning 24-hour news cycle and the nascent internet, showcased a society increasingly polarized over fundamental questions of morality, identity, and personal liberty. These weren't new debates. They were echoes and intensifications of the social upheavals that we witnessed in the 60s, as well as the conservative backlash that followed. However, the organized political force of the new right, combined with these new media platforms, gave these conflicts a sharper edge and a wider reach. The inability to find common ground on these deeply personal and moral issues, and the growing tendency to frame them as existential battles for the nation's soul, foreshadowed the even deeper partisan divides we feel today in the 21st century. The partisan rancor of the culture wars found a dramatic outlet in the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. The scandal began with an investigation by independent counsel Kenneth Starr into a pre-presidency Arkansas land deal known as Whitewater. This investigation expanded to include Clinton's affair with a 22-year-old White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. When news of the affair broke in January of '98, Clinton initially denied it, famously stating, quote, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky," end quote. However, further investigation, including Lewinsky's own testimony and physical evidence, led Starr to conclude that Clinton had committed perjury and obstructed justice. In a televised address on August 17, 1998, Clinton acknowledged an inappropriate relationship, but maintained that he had not committed impeachable offenses. Starr's report, sent to the House of Representatives, laid out 11 possible grounds for impeachment. In December 1998, the Republican-controlled House voted to impeach Clinton on 2 articles, one for perjury before a grand jury and another for obstruction of justice. This made Clinton only the second president in U.S. history to be impeached, the first being Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction. Nixon was never impeached. He resigned before being able to do so. The Senate trial commenced in January of '99. The debate centered on whether Clinton's actions, while widely condemned as morally reprehensible, did it constitute, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, warranting removal from office. Ultimately, in February, the Senate acquitted Clinton on both articles. Neither charge received the necessary 2/3 majority for conviction. The Clinton impeachment was a deeply polarizing event. While many Americans disapproved of Clinton's personal conduct, his job approval ratings remained remarkably high throughout the crisis, suggesting a public distinction between the private behavior and presidential performance. Critics of the impeachment, including many Democrats, viewed it as a partisan witch hunt, an attempt by Republicans to overturn the results of 2 elections using a personal scandal. Richard Posner, a legal scholar, characterized this era as one of post-election politics, where political battles are fought through revelation, investigation, and prosecution rather than the ballot box. The impeachment proceedings inevitably drew comparisons to the Watergate scandal that led to Nixon's resignation. However, the nature of the offenses, abuse of presidential power in Watergate versus lying about a consensual affair in the Clinton case, led to a significant debate about the threshold for impeachment. The Clinton impeachment, while failing to remove him from office, arguably lowered the threshold and normalized the use of such procedures as a tool of intense partisan warfare. And it further eroded public trust in political institutions, and it foreshadowed an era where personal scandal could dominate the national discourse, amplified by an ever more insistent 24/7 news cycle and the internet. Let's turn our attention now to the disputed election of 2000. The dawn of the new millennium was marked by one of the most contentious presidential elections in American history. The race between Republican George W. Bush, the son of former President George H.W. Bush, and Democrat Al Gore, Clinton's vice president, was extraordinarily close, ultimately coming down to a razor-thin margin in the state of Florida. What followed was a 36-day political and legal firestorm. Controversies erupted over confusing butterfly ballots in Palm Beach County, allegations of voter disenfranchisement, and the reliability of voting machines, and it led to demands for a manual recount. The Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide manual recount of undervotes, but the Bush campaign appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In a highly controversial 5-4 decision in Bush versus Gore, The U.S. Supreme Court effectively halted the Florida recount before it could finish, ruling that the lack of a uniform standard for recounting violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and that there was no time to implement a new standard before the federal deadline for selecting electors. This decision awarded Florida's 25 electoral votes to George W. Bush, making him president despite Al Gore having won the national popular vote. The outcome was met with intense debate and bitterness. Al Gore, in his concession speech, stated, quote, "While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it," end quote. However, many of his supporters felt the election had been unjustly decided. Justice John Paul Stevens, in his dissent, captured this sentiment, quote, "Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is pellucidly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law," end quote. The 2000 election exposed significant vulnerabilities in American electoral system and dramatically escalated the partisan mistrust. The intervention of the Supreme Court in deciding a presidential election was unprecedented in modern times and led to widespread accusations of judicial partisanship. This even built upon an increasing polarization witnessed during the Clinton impeachment and the ongoing culture wars. Historically, the 2000 election draws comparison to the disputed election of 1896 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. In that Gilded Age contest that we looked at, a special commission, also voting along partisan lines, awarded the presidency to Hayes despite Tilden winning the popular vote. That outcome eventually led to the Compromise of 1877, which effectively ended Reconstruction in the South, a decision, as we've seen, with profound and lasting consequences in America. While the specifics differed, both elections raised fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the outcome and the health of the democratic process, leaving the residue and bitterness that poison the political atmosphere to this day. The 2000 election in particular fueled a narrative of stolen elections that would once again gain even more traction in the decades that followed. The political divisions laid bare by the 2000 election were overshadowed by the horrific events of September 11, 2001. On that clear Tuesday morning, 19 al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175 were crashed into the north and south towers of the World Trade Center in New York, respectively. American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania after passengers and crew bravely fought back against the hijackers. Ask your parents or remember yourself where you were. It's one of those moments where everyone knows what they were doing. I was in class at a university. Where were you? Or your parents? Or your grandparents? The attacks resulted in the deaths of about 3,000 innocent people, including citizens from over 90 countries, and inflicted a deep psychological wound on the American psyche. The images of the collapsing Twin Towers and the burning Pentagon became indelible symbols of a new era of vulnerability. First-hand accounts of the survivors and the first responders paint a harrowing picture of chaos, of courage, and of the immense loss. Adrian Walsh, a New York City firefighter, later recalled the fall of the North Tower, while Robert Gray, a captain with the Arlington County Fire Department, described the grim task of searching for survivors at the Pentagon. Frank Rosano, a survivor from the Marriott Hotel at 3 World Trade Center, recounted his delayed evacuation and the collapse of the South Tower moments after he reached street level. President George W. Bush, who was in Florida at the time of the first attacks, was quickly moved to a secure location before returning to Washington, D.C. that evening. In an address to the nation, he declared, quote, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundation of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve," end quote. A few days later, on September 20th, addressing a joint session of Congress, Bush announced, quote, "Our grief has turned to anger and anger to resolution. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done." End quote. The attacks, often compared to Pearl Harbor in their shock value and unifying effect on the country, led to an immediate surge in patriotism and a desire for retribution. The 9/11 Commission report, published in 2004, would later analyze the intelligence failures leading up to the attacks and the nation's response, concluding that in the post 9/11 world, quote, "threats are defined more by the fault lines within societies than by the territorial boundaries between them. The American homeland is the planet." End quote. The September 11 attacks were a watershed moment, fundamentally reshaping American foreign and domestic policies, the reverberations we feel to this day. They ushered in an era defined by the War on Terror, leading to prolonged military engagements overseas, the creation of new government agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, and intense debates about national security versus civil liberties. The echoes continue into our contemporary world. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the Bush administration quickly identified Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network, operating from bases in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban regime, as the perpetrators. Bush issued an ultimatum to the Taliban, quote, "Delivered to United States authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in your land, close immediately and permanently every terrorist training camp in Afghanistan, and hand over every terrorist and every person in their support structure to appropriate authorities." End quote. When the Taliban refused, the United States, with the support of an international coalition, including Great Britain, launched Operation Enduring Freedom in October 7, 2001. The initial objectives were clear: dismantle al-Qaeda trading networks, topple the Taliban regime, and prevent Afghanistan from being used as a base for international terrorism. Initial military operations were swift, with Taliban forces removed from power in major cities like Kabul and Kandahar within weeks. The response to 9/11 also saw the articulation of a new framework for American policy, which came to be known as the Bush Doctrine. A key element of this doctrine was the principle of preemptive war, the assertion that the United States had the right to take military action against perceived threats before they could fully materialize, particularly from so-called rogue states or terrorist groups seeking weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. In his January 2002 State of the Union address, President Bush identified an axis of evil, naming North Korea, Iran, and Iraq as regimes that, quote, "and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil armed to threaten the peace of the world. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons." End quote. This speech signaled a significant shift. The Cold War doctrine of containment and deterrence, which had defined U.S. foreign policy for over 5 decades, was being supplemented now, if not only that, but replaced by a more offensive and unilateral posture. The Bush Doctrine was born from the trauma and the perceived new realities of the 9/11 attacks, and it was a radical departure from past precedents. It asserted a right to act preemptively and unilaterally if it was deemed necessary, fundamentally altering America's strategic posture and its relationship with international law and its alliances. This doctrine provided the ideological underpinning for subsequent invasions of Iraq, and it set the stage for prolonged military engagements and a globalized fight against a diffuse enemy, a fight that would define much of the first 2 decades of the 21st century and your life. Following the initial phase of the War on Terror in Afghanistan, the Bush administration turned its focus decisively towards Iraq and its leader, Saddam Hussein. The primary rationale offered for military intervention was Iraq's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, the WMDs, and its supposed link to terrorist groups like Al Qaeda, including the assertion that Iraq could provide terrorists with WMDs. President Bush in October 2002 warned, quote, facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud, end quote. The United States sought backing from the United Nations Security Council. Resolution 1441, passed unanimously in November of 2002, called on Iraq to cooperate fully with UN weapons inspectors and threatened serious consequences for noncompliance. However, the interpretation of this resolution became highly contentious. While the U.S. and its allies argued that Iraq was in material breach of its obligations, other key Security Council members, including France and Germany, opposed military action without further UN authorization. Secretary of State Colin Powell famously presented intelligence to the UN in February 2003, purporting to show that Iraq's WMD program and its links to terrorism. Despite significant international cooperation and massive anti-war protests worldwide, the U.S.-led coalition launched the invasion of Iraq on March 20, 2003, with an intense bombing campaign dubbed Shock and Awe. Iraqi resistance crumbled quickly, and Baghdad fell on April 9th. On May 1, 2003, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, President Bush declared an end to major combat operations under the banner proclaiming, "Mission accomplished." He stated, quote, "Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed." End quote. This declaration, however, proved tragically premature. No significant stockpiles of WMDs were ever found in Iraq, and the intelligence used to justify the war came under intense scrutiny and criticism. More devastatingly, the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime led not to a stable democracy, but to a power vacuum that was quickly filled by a brutal insurgency against U.S. and coalition forces and escalating sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia Iraqis. Conflict devolved into a protracted and bloody counterinsurgency campaign, leading to hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths and significant American casualties. The Iraqi War inevitably drew comparisons to the Vietnam War. Both involved questionable initial justifications, the challenge of fighting an elusive insurgency, mounting casualties, and eroding public support at home for such a war. Senator Robert Byrd, a long-serving Democrat, said this on the Senate floor, quote, "The gnawing and growing feeling that the goal of achieving U.S.-style democracy in Iraq is unattainable is reminiscent to the feeling that gripped America during Vietnam," end quote. The failure to find WMDs and the long, costly occupation severely damaged America's international credibility, and it fueled anti-American sentiment in the Middle East and beyond. The war became a defining event of the early 21st century, with profound and lasting consequences for regional stability and U.S. foreign policy to this day. On the domestic front, the Bush administration pursued a conservative agenda. Significant tax cuts were enacted in 2001 and 2003, which disproportionately benefited high-income individuals and corporations over middle-class Americans. Proponents argue that these cuts would stimulate economic growth, echoing the supply-side economics of the Reagan era. However, critics contended they primarily exacerbated the income inequality and contributed significantly to, again, a ballooning national debt without delivering the promised economic boom. A major legislative achievement was the No Child Left Behind Act in 2002. This bipartisan education reform aimed at increasing accountability in public schools, to improve the standards of education, and to close the achievement gaps that were between different student groups, particularly focusing on standardized testing to measure progress. While the NCLB, the act that I just mentioned, did shine a spotlight on the disparities within education that people knew were there for long times, it also faced widespread criticism for promoting what we call teaching to the test, meaning teaching only so that students can pass the test rather than teaching them the information that they need. And this had the effect of narrowing the curricula. It underfunded schools in low income areas that did poorly on tests, and it imposed unrealistic proficiency goals. Another significant domestic initiative was the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act of 2003. This created Medicare Part D, a prescription drug benefit for seniors, implemented in 2006. This program expanded access to medications for millions of older Americans. However, this was criticized for its complexity, the donut hole in coverage, the donut hole being a gap where beneficiaries faced high out of pocket costs, and its reliance on private insurance plans to deliver the benefit, which some argued actually drove up costs, and it didn't actually help. The Bush years were also marked by a devastating natural disaster that became a national crisis, Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005. The Category 5 hurricane slammed into the Gulf Coast, causing catastrophic damage, particularly in the city of New Orleans, where the levees failed, leading to massive flooding. Thousands were stranded, many seeking refuge in the Superdome Stadium under horrific conditions. The federal response, which was spearheaded by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, was widely condemned as too slow, too inept, and far too inadequate. A House Select Committee report later described the response as, quote, a litany of mistakes, misjudgments, lapses, and absurdities all cascading together, end quote. Katrina exposed starkly the deep veins of racial and class inequality in America. Poor and African American residents of New Orleans were disproportionately affected, lacking the resources to evacuate and suffering the most from the flooding and its aftermath. The disaster highlighted the enduring legacies of historical segregation and disinvestment in minority communities, issues tracing back to the failures of Reconstruction in the era of Jim Crow. The perceived failures in crisis management both during Katrina and later in the financial crisis significantly eroded public trust once again in the government's competence, and it fueled widespread disillusionment. Speaking of the financial collapse of 2008, as President Bush's second term was nearing its end, the nation was plunged into its most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression. And I'm talking again about this financial collapse in 2008. The crisis originated in a massive housing bubble, fueled by years of low interest rates, risky subprime mortgage lending to borrowers with poor credit, and the proliferation of complex financial instruments like mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps. A significant contributor factor was decades of financial deregulation. Notably, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999, signed by President Clinton, had repealed key provisions of the New Deal era Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. That law was what separated commercial and investment banking from one another. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000, also signed by Clinton, exempted many over-the-counter derivatives, like credit default swaps, from being regulated. These deregulatory moves, spanning multiple administrations, allowed for increasing risk and opaque financial practices at banks to take hold. When the housing bubble burst and homeowners began to default on their mortgages in large numbers, the values of these complex securities plummeted, triggering a cascade of failures that echoed throughout the financial system. Major institutions like Bear Stearns and the Lehman Brothers collapsed or were on the brink of collapse, and the global credit markets froze. In response, the Bush administration in October 2008 pushed for and signed the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which created $700 billion in the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. TARP authorized the Treasury Department to purchase these troubled assets and inject capital directly into the banks and other financial institutions to prevent a complete meltdown of the financial system. The idea, as described by one of our sources, was to, quote, stabilize the market, relieve consumer debt, and bolster the auto industry, end quote. TARP was immensely controversial. Supporters argued it was a necessary evil, this government intervention and bailout, to avert a global economic depression. But critics labeled it as a bailout for Wall Street firms who had recklessly and unnecessarily caused the crisis, arguing that it rewarded their bad and risky decisions and did little to help the ordinary homeowners facing foreclosure because of their recklessness. The crisis and the subsequent government response highlighted the profound interconnectedness and the fragility, once again, of the modern global financial system, and it forced a reluctant embrace of massive government intervention. And it challenged the prevailing free market ideologies that had dominated policy for decades. Deregulation is one of the reasons that caused this. It also laid bare the consequences of long-term policy trends towards deregulation, echoing the historical debates from the Progressive Era and the New Deal that we talked about in earlier episodes about the necessity and the necessary role of the government in regulating and overseeing the economy. The financial crisis of 2008 formed a dramatic backdrop to the presidential election that year. Amidst this economic turmoil and once again widespread disillusionment with the Bush administration and the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Senator Barack Obama of Illinois emerged as a transformative figure. Campaigning on the themes of hope and change, Obama, the first-term senator and former constitutional law professor, as well as a community organizer, defeated Republican Senator John McCain to become the first African-American president of the United States. Obama's victory was a landmark moment in U.S. history, widely seen as the culmination of the long civil rights movement. In his victory speech delivered in Grant Park, Chicago, before a massive and emotional crowd, Obama declared, quote, "If there is anyone out there that still doubts that America is the place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer," end quote. His candidacy had mobilized a diverse coalition of voters, particularly young people and minorities, and his consistent opposition to the Iraq War resonated with an increasingly anti-war electorate. The racial significance of Obama's election was undeniable. As one commentary noted, quote, "President Obama's election marks continued progress towards our highest ideals of freedom and equality, affording all Americans great hope about the promise of our Constitution," end quote. However, the same commentary cautioned this, quote, "Yet, some mistake this critical milestone as the end of our nation's ongoing journey towards racial equality," end quote. Indeed, the Obama election was a powerful symbol of progress. Analyses of voting patterns revealed continued racial polarization, with the majority of white voters not supporting him. The idea of this post-racial America, which was heralded by many, quickly proved to be an oversimplification as racial tensions and disparities persisted. Obama's election, therefore, was a complex event. It represented a profound breakthrough, demonstrating that an African American could attain the nation's highest office, a testament to the struggles and sacrifices of the civil rights movement. Yet it also served to highlight the enduring presence of racial anxieties and divisions in American society. The intense opposition his presidency would face, some of it tinged with racial animus and fueling movements like the Tea Party, indicated that while a significant barrier had been broken, the journey towards full racial equality and understanding was far from over. This set the stage for new dynamics in American political discourse, where race would become an even more explicit and often contentious fault line. President Obama took office in January 2009, facing the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. His immediate response and focus was to prevent a complete economic collapse and to stimulate a recovery. A key legislative response was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This was a $831 billion stimulus package. It combined government spending on infrastructure, education, and clean energy with tax cuts for individuals and businesses. Obama articulated the rationale for this, stating, quote, "We have to be bold, we have to act fast, and we have to think of the future that we wish to build," end quote. The act's stated goal was to, quote, "jumpstart our economy, create or save millions of jobs, and put down a payment on addressing long neglected challenges," end quote. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was highly controversial. Supporters, citing analyses from the Congressional Budget Office and economists like Mark Zandi, argue it prevented a deeper depression and contributed to GDP growth and job creation. Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke testified that without such investment, the U.S. might face, quote, "an extraordinarily severe downturn, perhaps a Great Depression," end quote. Critics, however, questioned its effectiveness, its size, and its impact on the national debt, with some arguing that government incentives for private spending would have been more effective. The Obama administration also continued and expanded the bailout of the American auto industry, primarily General Motors and Chrysler, which had been initiated under President Bush. This involvement included substantial government loans and, in the case of GM, the government taking a temporary equity stake. President Obama defended this intervention, declaring, quote, "We cannot and must not, and we will not let our auto industry simply vanish. This industry is like no other. It's an emblem of the American spirit," end quote. The auto bailout was credited by supporters with saving hundreds of thousands of jobs and preventing the collapse of a critical manufacturing sector. The critics, however, argued it was an unwarranted government interference in the free market, potentially favoring unions and costing taxpayers billions. The Treasury estimated eventual losses from the auto bailout, though supporters pointed to the broader economic benefits of preventing a catastrophic industry failure. The Obama administration's economic interventions inevitably drew comparisons to FDR's New Deal programs during the Great Depression. Both involved large-scale government spending to combat economic crises and create jobs. However, Obama operated in a far more politically polarized environment than FDR did, at least in the early New Deal years. The stimulus faced immediate and staunch opposition from Republicans and the burgeoning Tea Party movement, which limited its potential scope and fueled ongoing debates about its efficacy and the role of government in the economy. Ultimately, the economic recovery following the 2008 crisis was slower and more protracted than they had hoped, and persistent unemployment and stagnant wages for a significant portion of the population. And this highlighted the deep structural challenges facing the American economy in the 21st century. Now, President Obama had a signature domestic policy achievement during this first term, and that was the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, the ACA, commonly known as Obamacare, and this happened in March of 2010. This legislation aimed to expand health insurance coverage, also to control healthcare costs, and to reform the insurance market. The ACA introduced several key provisions. It prohibited insurance companies from denying coverage or charging higher premiums based on pre-existing conditions. It allowed young adults to remain on their parents' insurance plans until age 26. It established health insurance marketplaces or exchanges where individuals and small businesses could compare and purchase plans. It provided subsidies to make insurance more affordable for low and middle income individuals, and it expanded the Medicaid program to cover more low-income adults, though a Supreme Court ruling later made this expansion optional for states. The law also included an individual mandate requiring most Americans to have health insurance or pay a penalty, a provision that was later repealed. Obama passionately defended the ACA, often framing it as a moral imperative. He declared, quote, "In the United States of America, health care is not a privilege for the fortunate few. It is a right," end quote. He also famously promised, quote, "If you like your health care plan, you'll be able to keep your health care plan, period." a statement that proved controversial when some existing plans were indeed canceled for not meeting ACA standards. The push for a national healthcare reform had a long and often frustrating history in the United States, with presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Harry Truman to Bill Clinton attempting and failing to achieve comprehensive coverage. The ACA thus represented the most significant expansion of healthcare access since the creation of Medicare and Medicaid under LBJ's Great Society in 1965. The ACA, however, faced immediate and ferocious political opposition, particularly from Republicans and the Tea Party movement. Opponents decried it as government overreach, a step towards what they called socialized medicine. It was an infringement on individual liberty, they said. Activist David Limbaugh stated, quote, "It is not an overstatement to say Obamacare was the single most important catalyst leading to the Tea Party movement," end quote. Signs at Tea Party rallies frequently read, "No Obamacare." But despite the intense political battles and numerous legal challenges, the ACA did lead to a significant reduction in the number of uninsured Americans. However, it also became a central and enduring symbol of the deep ideological divisions still within American society, especially regarding the government's role in the economy as well as in healthcare. Does the government need to have a social welfare system? The debate over the ACA crystallized the fundamental disagreements between individual responsibility, market forces, and collective provision, a debate that continues to shape American politics today. In terms of foreign policy, President Obama sought to recalibrate America's global role after the Bush years, which were dominated by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the broader war on terror. A key campaign promise was the ending of the war in Iraq. Following the U.S. Iraq Status of Forces Agreement, approved in late 2008, U.S. combat forces withdrew from Iraqi cities in June 2009, with the last American combat troops leaving in December 2011. While this marked the official end of the U.S. military mission, Iraq continued to face significant violence and instability. In Afghanistan, Obama initially authorized a troop surge in 2009, deploying an additional 33,000 troops as part of a counterinsurgency strategy aimed at disrupting and dismantling, defeating al Qaeda, and pushing back the Taliban. However, he simultaneously announced a timeline for the beginning of a U.S. withdrawal in July 2011. This approach reflected a complex balancing act between military recommendations for a robust counterinsurgency effort and a political desire to wind down the long war and shift towards a more targeted counterterrorism strategy. A major success in the fight against al Qaeda came in May 2011 when President Obama authorized a covert U.S. Navy SEAL raid on a compound in Pakistan, which resulted in the killing of Osama bin Laden. This was a significant symbolic and strategic victory in the war on terror. Beyond these specific conflicts, Obama articulated a broader foreign policy vision that emphasized multilateral diplomacy and engagement. His 2009 speech in Cairo, Egypt, aimed to seek, quote, "a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world, one based on mutual interest and mutual respect," end quote. Later that year, upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Obama acknowledged the complexities of war and peace, stating, quote, "We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations, acting individually or in concert, will find the use of force not only necessary but morally justified," end quote. Yet he stressed the importance of international cooperation in a world free from nuclear weapons. Obama's foreign policy approach sought to differentiate itself from a perceived unilateralism of the Bush Doctrine. It aimed to restore America's standard in the world by emphasizing diplomacy, internal cooperation, and what we call soft power, while still reserving the right to use military force when necessary. Another marked shift from the more militaristic Reagan doctrine of the 80s and the preemptive stance of the Bush years. And this reflected a nation grappling with the costs and consequences of nearly a decade of continuous warfare in the Middle East and seeking a more sustainable way to ensure its security and advance its interests in a multipolar world. So, as we conclude this final episode in season one, we did take a rather superficial look at the last 20 plus years of United States history. And so, we're going to conclude this journey through the recent past from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the end of Barack Obama's first term. And this is where your lived experience then fills in the gap. Now is your time to look at the past recently and connect it to all that we have learned in the previous episodes, all the way back to the end of the Civil War in 1865. It's clear that this period, from the beginning of our course to the end, was one of profound transformation in United States history, but also one of enduring tensions. Specifically for the Obama term, the optimism of a new world order that began in the 1990s gave way to the complexities of globalization. The digital revolution has brought unprecedented connectivity and new forms of conflict. The tragedy of 9/11 reshaped America's role in the world and its sense of security at home. The economic roller coaster that saw the dot-com boom and bust, followed by a housing bubble that precipitated the Great Recession. Politically, the era was marked with intense partisan polarization, from the culture wars and Clinton's impeachment to the disputed 2000 election and the fierce debates surrounding the Affordable Care Act. Yet it was also a time of historic breakthroughs, most notably the election of the nation's first African American president. As our textbook reminds us, quoting William Faulkner, quote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past," end quote. The events and decisions of these crucial decades continue to shape our present realities. The debates over economic inequality, racial justice, and the role of the government, as well as national security and America's place in a continually rapidly changing world, are not relics of history. They are the very fabric of ongoing national conversation. And when you look back throughout this course, you will notice how that conversation has changed over time. Understanding this recent past in connection with our history, with all of its trials, all of its triumphs, all of its tribulations, its continuities with deeper historical currents, and its sharp departures, is essential for navigating the challenges and opportunities of today and tomorrow. The story of America is always unfolding, and each generation brings new voices, new perspectives, and new chapters to be written. I'm Dr. G, and I want to thank you for joining me on Star-Spangled Studies this season, and I hope that your exploration of the recent past has been both informative and thought-provoking. For me, I'm going to continue to dive deeper into issues and ideas and events and people that was covered only superficially in this beginning introductory course. So join me in the past in future episodes as we look and dive deeper into United States history. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging with the past that shapes our present. I'll see y'all in the past.